Hey guys, it's Kevin with MixCoach. This is episode 102 of the MixCoach podcast. Today is another excerpt that we took from a question and answer session over at MixCoach Member in video and audio format. And we're going to be talking about my workflow for how I print multiple mixes in one pass. It's a really good time saver, especially if you're using Pro Tools 10 or a system that doesn't balance out in faster than real time. So check it out. Hey guys, it's Kevin and John from MixCoach. We've got several of our Mix coaches online here, and this is the monthly Q&A. Everything's, we're an open book. Anything I know and I can teach, I will gladly teach, and John feels the same way. It's a great community that way. So this is the webinar about mixing the Christmas song, Give Love on Christmas Day. So we have a question already from Danny. And Danny, your mic is unmuted, so go for it, man.
Okay, thanks, Kevin.
Yes, sir.
Maybe I'm explaining it wrong, but when you get your mix up and you get everything routed out and everything, you've got a final mix, you've got a TV mix, you've got an instrument mix, and you've got different kind of end mixes on your DAW after you mixed, in order to get specific parts like background vocal instrument mix, 2-track.
Okay. Well,
and the routing of that, I'm you see, trying to get the tracks that's already been mixed, and then trying to. I'm not sure how to route it into a 2-track stereo in order to save that on the same page as tracks itself.
Right. Okay. I think I understand, and let me just take a stab at it. And if let me go from front to back about what I think you're talking about in my workflow. And if I miss anything, I'll do a follow-up, and you can. So what I'll do usually is I create a bunch of stereo auxiliary inputs, which is the same kind of input that you would put a reverb, so that you could do a send to it and route it to an output of some kind. So what I'll do is I'll create. Let's just keep it really simple, and let's do 4 stereo buses. Okay. So stereo bus 1 is an auxiliary input, just like it would be a reverb or a delay that you would send stuff to, and it would come back as an auxiliary input on the mix. So what I'll do is I'll create, let's just say 4 now. There's actually more than that when you factor in some of the more complex things. But number 1, all of the drums I'll route to the input of whatever this one is, and I call it drum. So instead of the drums going out to the actual mix that you're listening to, they're actually going to that input of that bus, much like it would be, so you can't hear it unless that bus is unmuted. So I'll do one for drums, and like I said, it's more complex than this, but let's just say that all the drums went to 1, all the instruments went to 1, all the vocals went to 1, and then all the orchestra went to 1. So we've got 4 buses with different things coming through them. So these are like sub mixes or sub faders, like on a live console would be like the subgroup. You know how on live consoles you can either route it to a left and right, or you can route it through the subgroups and left and right, but you would want to lift it out of the left and right. So it's not going directly to the path that you hear. It's going through a bus to the left and right bus. And then what happens is, now let's just say I've got 100 tracks on this end of the console, but they're all coming through one of these 4 buses. If they're not, it's not really working the way I want it to, and it's not really it's not as discrete as it needs to be. So everything on my console is coming through one of these 4 buses. If it's not, then we can't hear it. So then I just pretend like these are already mixed, even though they're not. It's like these are 4 stereo tracks, but they're not audio tracks. That may be what's throwing you, Danny, is maybe you're trying to do audio tracks. Probably not, but it could be. So now, off of these 4, what I'll do is off of the drums and instruments and orchestra bus, I will do an auxiliary send on those as if they're going to a reverb 2, and I'll send it to the the um, the TV mix. So no vocal is going to that mix. So it's just these three, right?
Yep.
So and then if I want to do a soundtrack, I just send the instruments no background vocals. And then if I want to hear everything, which is the mix, I send all four of these to a master fader. That's the only time I do a master fader is right there. So, and that's usually to put a like some kind of a brick wall limiter there as a safety precaution. So that's what I'll do. I'll, instead of routing everything to the left and right, I'll route them through a set of buses first, and then those buses go to the left and right.
Yep.
Does that make sense, Danny?
Yeah, that makes sense. Now I see what I'm doing wrong now, so I'm going to give it a try after the
Okay,
webinar and
Cool.
see
awesome.
what
Yeah,
happens.
yeah, it's interesting. Like it was hard for me whenever I first started doing things that way because I would always just kind of go with 1 and 2, go out 1, 2, and balance that way. But like whenever you think about like grouping things together in these previous sections, it becomes a lot easier that way. But whenever you go to print it, I always think of it as like a subtractive process rather than an additive process. You're saying, okay, so from the full mix, what do I need to subtract to get the type of mix that I want? So if it's an instrument mix, I want to subtract the vocals. And then so if you're like, okay, well I want it to be a TV mix, which includes like background vocals, what do you subtract from that? It is the lead vocal. And then so you just kind of think about like, okay, so to get the mix that I want, what do I subtract? And then so you send everything else of those buses to a track, and then that's the way you do that. Just kind of like it
So
always boggled my mind about, okay, which things do I send for this type of thing? But it's more like, hey, what do you subtract from the full mix for this thing?
it's funny, Danny. I'm glad that you're asking these questions because these are questions that are a little bit more advanced, and it is easier. And I've seen a lot of people do it too, where it's a lot easier in the front just to say, hey, I want to keep my signal chain clean. I'm going to send everything to the left and right bus, and that's better because there's less atoms that have to do with whatever. But really, there's not really that much difference if there's any difference at all. Where the difference comes in is when somebody says, hey, can you run me a TV track?
Yep.
And it's already run. Boom, you're a hero, and people bring you their next project because you're thinking ahead of them.
Yeah. Or at
Okay,
the very
so
least, it's like set up and ready to hit record arm, and you just print it like right then.
yeah,
You don't have to
and then
sit there and go
right. Well, and here's one other thing, and I just got off the phone with Landon, the executive producer of Taranda's project, this big Christmas project, and this is where I'm trying to train myself to think further and further in the future. Okay, so when you do a big project like this that's got orchestra stems, when there's another big project like this, typically Taranda will sing these possibly at a huge concert hall next Christmas. And there may be an orchestra there may not be. There may be a live band with no orchestra. There may be an orchestra with no live band. There may be background vocals, but they want background vocals from the record too, just to pad it out. So not surprisingly, the executive producer wants Taranda to have a full set of stem mixes. Stem mixes are, I'm sure you know what they are, but if you don't know what they are, what stem mixes are is basically the mix that you could, like a stereo drum mix with reverb, bass guitar, electric guitar, piano, all vocals, background vocals, and in this case, orchestra.
Yep.
So what you aim for when you do these stem mixes is that he could import it into a brand new Pro Tools session, push everything to 0, and it would sound just like her record. And then he could mute whatever he didn't want, whoever was not there that night. A lot of times with high production kind of bands that may or may not have a brass section one night, but they may the next night, or maybe a singer's sick one night and they want to unmute his track so that he can just kind of take it easy and still the show must go on, but all of his parts are going to be there. So what I want to do is to figure out a way for when I do records like this is to go ahead and set up for the stems, because right now what we're finding is that he wants all these stems, and now our only option, see, and this is where I read a quote the other day. I forget what it was, but basically, like if you're going into outer space, it only takes about that much. So when you get to the moon, you're way off. You're way off, and that's kind of where we are here because we've mixed 8 or 9 tracks all with orchestra, and now our only option is to go back, put the mix and record, call it the org track, and mute everything but the orchestra and run it in real time. Of course, we're using Pro Tools 11. I mean Pro Tools 10. I know it with the other versions. It wouldn't make any difference though, because with this many tracks, this many plugins and everything, it's going to be pretty much a real-time bounce, if that. So we're better off just to print it. So that's going to take forever. So, Danny, I'm glad you're asking about this because when you mix for someone else, or and you're already ahead of them, like you already ran an instrumental track, boom. I mean, I'm coming back to you next time. That's what we want to. That's kind of why we're talking about this stuff because that's the way I want you to be. That's the way. I want people to say, "Wow, how did you think of that?"
For sure.
It's because Kevin, stepped in the mud too many times, and he showed me how to do it. So.
Yeah, the biggest thing I think whenever I have run into like that situation, Kev, where it's like, oh no, I'm gonna have to run these individually, was always reverbs, or was always like something like that, where you're using one effect on both, like on multiple groups of instruments. Where it's like I'm putting the guitar, that reverb, I like that reverb for the guitars and the vocals, so I'm just going to send them through the same reverb. And so then you get into like, oh my gosh, if I only have to print the instrument, I can't print it at the same time that I'm printing the vocals because it's all going to go to that same reverb, and who knows where it goes there, So you'll end up with vocal in your guitar reverb, and you'll end up with reverb, guitar reverb in your vocal. So it's always, I always try to keep it, even if I'm using the exact same reverb for each thing, where it's like I'm going to use the TL Space Hall for both guitars and for vocals, I usually try to keep those separate as long as I have the processing power to do so. But on a large project like that, it's like I can imagine running out of processing, or it just bogs down your system a little bit more every time you do another separate thing. So, which is why it's important when you do stuff like this. And I know there's two sides of this argument, but there's a freedom in limitations. Like when you're eventually going to run out of voices, you're going to run out of CPU, you're going to run out of stuff. I mean, there's a freedom that comes in saying, hey, you know what? I'm not going to have 3 first violin tracks. I'm going to have 1, and I'm going to pan it right there. Yep. And then you bounce it to 1, and that's a decision that, like, if you put it down and the phase is good and all that stuff, then you're actually in better shape. So it's good to make decisions along the way. But anyway, so good, Danny. So awesome. Raise your hand if that answered your question, or your mic is on. Speak up. Yeah, go ahead and let us know if that answered your question.
Yeah, that's no problem. That answered my question.
Awesome. Perfect. Okay, cool.
The MixCoach podcast takes both submitted questions from our free members and live questions from our pro members. And if you would like to submit a question or find out how to become a pro member, head over to mixcoach.com/free.